for this very nice introduction. I will try to share my screen because I have prepared a few slides. Let's see. That should work. Okay, so I will talk a little bit about disasters, climate change, and disaster risk management in the context of block number 1, disability, inclusive climate justice. But to be honest, in the beginning, I was a bit unsure what I could contribute because I'm not an expert in justice questions concerning from a philosophical, ethical, or legal part, but I know a little bit about climate change and disaster risk management. So what I will do is to just set the frame a little bit and point out why it is important to also, or not also, to definitely talk about inclusive climate justice or climate adaptation. So my name is Christian Barthelt. I work for the Munich Re Foundation. Carlos already introduced it. We are a non-profit organization working, I think, for the last 16 years in the fields of climate change, adaptation, disaster risk management, and more. And we are focusing so far on 4 fields of action. Number 1 is that we work in the field of education on climate change and sustainability. Here we cooperate with a lot of universities, for example, the United Nations University, but also with regional schools, for example. Our second pillar is inclusive insurance. What does that mean? We try to foster knowledge, products, regulation, etc., to also include people who have not access to the regular insurance market, because we strongly believe that insurance is one very important tool for disaster risk management. And the insurance gap in many countries is just still too big. So many disaster risk management options are just inefficient without insurance schemes, and we try to close that insurance gap. Third pillar is that we work in the field of water, providing drinking water in very arid regions, and this will be even more important in the years to come with the climate change consequences. And we are focusing on unconventional water resources, especially folk nets. What does that mean? You can literally hang up folk nets or nets in very mountain regions and filter folk out of the air and create drinking water. It's a very niche project, but I think it has, or we think it has, great potential. And the last column, and this is why I am here and how I got to know Carlos Kaiser, is the disaster risk reduction column, where we, together with the UNDRR, host and organize the so-called Risk Award. The Risk Award is more or less an application vehicle where we look for outstanding, innovative projects every 2 years and fund it with a significant sum up to 100,000 euros. And here, like Carlos has said, we funded his initiative of inclusive and fair disaster risk management in Peñaflor as a pilot project for real inclusive disaster risk management. I don't want to go into more details about the foundation, but I said I would like to frame the issue a little bit about climate change, risk management, and inclusion. What you can see here is a graph which will soon start to move, and it's a clear signal for that we are already in the middle of climate change. It's not a future topic. It's an actual, very recent topic, and it's a burning topic. So what can we see here? On the outer circle, you see all countries of our Earth bundled in the continents. And then here you have the big, well, thick gray line, which stands for the 0 line. So to make it more easy, we take Burkina Faso, for example, here. In the year 1900, the temperature in Burkina Faso was 1 degree too hot compared to an average mean. If we, for example, take Vanuatu, here the very last one, Vanuatu in 1900 was roughly 0.2 degrees too cold. And what I will do now is to start this graph, and we will see how this development went on until nowadays. So you see in the beginning a big mixture of blue, yellowish, reddish, but it stays more or less around the 0 line. But then from 1970-80 on, the situation changes because the blue bars really vanish more or less, and we see a lot of reddish or orange bars. And what's new, the dark red bars. The dark red bars mean that we are already in a phase where we see temperature increases of 2 degrees and even more. And from 2000 on, we hardly see any blue bars anymore. So we are already in the middle of global heating, more or less. As I said, it's not a future topic. What does that mean? How does it, or is it linked to disasters? Higher temperatures here on the left-hand side, this is a very simplistic picture, mean that a warmer air can absorb more water. More water in the air means that we have more water vapor in the atmosphere with a higher evaporation in specific regions. That leads to more droughts in that regions because we have more water in the atmosphere, less on the ground. If it then rains on the very right-hand side, we will see more disastrous events, so increased precipitation. And so one direct consequence of the hotter air in our atmosphere is that we will see more droughts and more flood events, or at least more intense flood events, like we've seen this year in Europe, but also in many Asian countries, etc., etc. What would be the easiest way out here? The easiest way out would be that we try to stop climate change. We try to stay well below 1.5 or 2 degrees, because then the consequences will not be too drastically. But what's the reality? A few weeks ago, we had the conference of the parties, the World Climate Conference in Glasgow, where all the countries for the first time since 2015, when they promised to do so, opened their or published their climate protection goals, their so-called nationally determined contributions. So they had to publish what their ambitions are in related to climate protection. The results, I have to say, are a little bit frustrating. There are a lot of organizations, institutes, think tanks who analyzed these NDCs, and they came up with very clear results, and they are not very promising. There's only one country, according to the Climate Action Tracker, for example, in our world, which is Gambia, which is so ambitious that we would be on a 1.5 degree pathway if the whole world would act like Gambia. If the whole world, for example, would act like Europe in the coming years, we would be on a pathway below 3 degrees, but way far away from a 2 degree pathway. And here you see there are only very few countries like Gambia, Costa Rica, Morocco, or UK who move on a track below 2 degrees. The vast majority of the countries is moving beyond that. So in reality, we are not on a track which will lead us in a future below 2 degrees, but into a future something around 2.4, 2.7, 3 degrees, with the consequences I showed you before. If we have a look at the statistics, we can also prove that we have an increase of disasters already today. So we don't have to wait for the future. We see that already today. This is coming from the database of Munich Re, our founder. They have a huge database called NatCat service, and they monitor disasters per year since I think 50 years or 60 years, but the database is very sound and valid from 1980 on. This is why this graph starts in 1980. So in the 1980s, we had roughly 220, 250 events per year. What does event mean? Event means that at least one human victim was to mourn, or $1 million US dollars in losses occurred. In the 1990s, we already had around 300 to 400, and nowadays we are up to 800, in some years even up to 900 events per year. So we see a clear increase of disasters caused by natural hazards. One could now argue that these increases caused by urbanization, demographic change, etc. But here again, we see a clear indicator that climate change is causing this increase. Because if you have a look at the 4 perils, you see clear differences. The red peril, which are the geophysical events, have nothing to do with climate change. Earthquakes happen without climate change or not. The same applies to tsunamis or volcanic activities, and they more or less stay stable. But all 3 other categories or perils, so the meteorological events, the hydrological events like floods and mass movements, but also the climatological events, are related to climate questions or to temperatures. And here you see the huge increase. So the world is too slow when it comes to minimizing climate change, and we already see a huge number of disasters, which is increasing over the years. What can we do? The nearest answer now is disaster risk management. And of course, you're all disaster risk management experts. I don't have to go into too much detail here, but if we have a very simplistic look at the two main phases of disaster risk management, you have the risk mitigation part, so what happens before a disaster strikes, and we have the recovery part. In red, you see the line, the impact line on the society. The problem nowadays is that still too many governments, local governments, municipalities, but also NGOs are focusing on the recovery part. They only act if something happens, and this will not lead us into a fruitful or safe future. So we have to invest more into the left-hand part here, the risk mitigation part, preparation. What does that mean? It can be train the trainer workshops, investing more in safe infrastructures, insurance programs, capacity training, early warning systems, etc., etc., etc. And here is a huge potential. So we need to focus more on that risk mitigation. And since we now have to do that more urgently than ever, now is the important time to do that in an inclusive manner. Madame Mitsutori already has told us that, and Asako Okai, UN Assistant Secretary General and Director of the UNDP, also stated that people with disabilities or persons with disabilities are 2 to 4 times more likely to get hit or to die during a disaster than other people, other members of communities. So we have to really make them a core part of disaster risk management. And this is unfortunately not the case in many regions nowadays. What does inclusion mean? I think we have to talk about 2 main levels here. One is who has to be included. And here I would open up the scope, because in many societies still women are underrepresented. In many societies it's the elderly. Often it's the people with disabilities, but also children, for example. And all of them have specific needs, and we need to hear their voices already from the beginning when we talk about disaster risk management. And inclusion must take place on different levels. We have heard from Madame Mitsutori what the Sendai framework does, or the Paris Agreement, and also the SDGs, for example. They are important because they are overarching international frameworks, and they care for the visibility of the topic, and they more or less trickle down into the national levels. But then it's really important to get an understanding and to really the enthusiasm of regional action planners, for example, mayors or fire brigades, etc. So they have to be aware of all that thinking as well. And then one very important part is as well the on-the-ground actions, so driven by NGOs, for example, in grassroots projects. They have to embed that inclusion thinking as well. And only if we manage to combine these 3 levels more or less, so from top-down approach with the bottom-up approach, then I think we can reach all parts of a society, and we will see really sustainable, inclusive disaster risk management. And this is why I also think that summits like this Inclusive DRR Summit of Carlos Kaiser is so important, because here we can do the necessary capacity training, the information exchange of different stakeholders, and we can communicate to each other. And communication is one of the most important things at all in disaster risk management. Thank you very much for having the floor here, and I now hand over to Carlos again. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them now or later in the question round. Thank you.